Ho, 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 everybody. Welcome to the final Talent Agenda series session of 2021, where we're joined by a couple of friends from companies that we've worked with and enjoyed working with over the year to look back at what's been going on and look forward at, what we have to look forward to. So I'm Alex Mugan from Global Career Company and hosting the webinar today. And I'm delighted to be joined by Eve and Tasantha. Tasantha representing Mercer and Eve representing Willis Towers Watson. And as a way of introducing them to you, I'd love to give them a second just to tell you a little bit about who they are, what they do, and what they've been doing this year to kick things off. And then we'll get into some questions that we've got prepared. And from there, we'll go into questions that you send in as we go along. So feel free to send those in right from the word go. We'll go to the questions, I think, all the way through the session. So if anything springs to mind, send it in because I might not catch it. And then we can fire the questions to them and keep them on their toes. They've got some prepared questions that I've sent to them before, but it's always much more fun when you send more interesting questions than I did and wrong foot them. So fire away with those. And first, maybe Tasantha, if you could just give us a quick overview of the year in your role and what you've been up to.
Thanks. Hi, everyone, and thanks, Alex, for the nice introduction. Welcome, everyone. I'm really excited to actually have this conversation. So, Alex, I think just what's been going on this year in terms of Mercer and our focus, we've very much been having a lot of conversations around, the talent agenda, looking at flexibility, employee experience, the employee value proposition, and also a big focus on skills and the creation of the agile workforce. So in terms of my focus, it's very much having those interactive discussions with clients to understand, what are their pain points, what can they focus on next, and very much trying to transition to help them prepare, so we don't know what's coming next or what next year will hold for organizations. But what we know is we can prepare or try our best to prepare so that we're not hit and negatively impacted as we were last year, and still recovering very much this year. So that in a nutshell is what we've been focusing on.
Fantastic. I think these are themes that we're certainly going to be coming to over the course of the session, and familiar themes as well. So thank you very much. Eve, what have you been up to? Long time no see as well.
Hi, everybody. Hi, Alex and Tess. Bonjour. I saw quite a few bonjour on the right-hand side in the chat. So I'm here from Willis Towers Watson. And actually, our areas of focus have been very similar to what Tess was describing. Very much the employee experience, very much understanding how the pandemic has affected that experience and supporting our clients really to make sense of it, to see where the surprises are, the things that were expected, and helping them through. Because it's really challenging times at the moment and very shifty environments in terms of how people are feeling and so on. So, and we'll talk about that today. So yeah, very exciting time. And at this point in the year, I'm presenting a lot of engagement survey results to leadership teams and discussing them. So I have some fresh insights on that. And it's always fun to see how leaders are reacting to employees, these results of surveys, and where the surprises are in particular.
Fantastic. Sounds intriguing. I think we'll come back to that one later on. So you can see from our panel today, I don't know if we're a panel, we're more like a kind of virtual sofa that we're conversing around. You can see from our panel today that we come prepared from a couple of the kind of continent's leading authorities on the areas around employee experience and value proposition and how we adapt our businesses to deal with all this stuff that has been going on. It used to be simple. It used to be relatively easy, and now look at it. But how resilient we are and how well we're adapting, or perhaps we are. And anyway, here are some authorities to help us do it even better. So good morning as well to Godson. We've got Godson on the chat and Daniel Kamara on the chat as well. Good morning to all of you. If anybody else wants to pop messages on the chat, please feel free. If you want to send in your Christmas drawings, feel free. If you want me to give you a shout out for your birthday, it's a seasonal webinar. We're doing all that stuff today. But first, let's get to some serious business. And I wanted to ask you, Tasantha, tell us about something new, something that you learned this year, either from a client or a perspective, or something that's really come through for you in your thinking this year? Tell us something new.
So, Alex, I think definitely a learning for me is changing to, we use the term agile so loosely over many, many years. And then we look at skills and we're like, no, we need an agile workforce. And I don't really think many organizations actually sort of absorbed what that agile workforce meant in terms of, the employees, how are they impacted by that. So the biggest learning for me was like that shift from, the old way and the old school way of working, of looking at job descriptions, right? So you'll have like a 15-page job description for a role, for example, and then updated every few years. It's a pain for HR, it's a pain for the team. And then sometimes, those job descriptions were actually designed around the person, not around the job that was needed. And then that shift now to role profiles. So in one job, for example, you can have 5 role profiles, and a person needs to be able to fulfill any of those role profiles at any given time. So that shift in the skill set, so the job description basically, you wrote out activities and then try to retrofit skills, whereas that shift to skills now is identifying what skills are needed for that role, for that job, and then what does the individual need to get there. And what we saw actually was only 2 in 5 HR professionals actually knew what skills exist in their organization today. So that conversation became very, very important this year, and that was my biggest learning.
Okay, interesting. 2 in 5, just 2 in 5 of you understand what skills exist in your organisation. That is shocking, and you should all be ashamed of yourselves. That's the message. That's my message, not Tasantha's message. I think Tasantha, if you're one of the 3 in 5 then who doesn't know what they've got, where do you start?
I think first, Alex, it's basically trying to start understanding what skills exist in the organization today. And a lot of the time, traditionally, HR worked very much in isolation from the rest of the business. So when we spoke about workforce planning, it was a very linear process. So it was never actually understanding, what do you need in 2 years' time, what do you need in 5 years' time. And then just another stat for you, I guess only 9% of organizations that we've been speaking to actually monitor the market to understand, what skills are available versus what they need. So that's a bit concerning, considering when you get to a point and you need a skill and it doesn't exist, what do you do?
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
definitely the journey starts with understanding what you have, then understanding what you'll need, but working very collaboratively with business to understand what the business strategy is. And also, creating that level of transparency across your organization when we talk about, diversity, equity, and inclusion. So creating equal opportunities for all. So if there's a skill that's in shortage, are you communicating it to the entire organization and giving them that ability or creating opportunities to actually, build or grow in that space? So that's definitely a starting point if you haven't already.
Fantastic, thank you. So as we open up areas of the discussion, it'd be great to see questions popping up in the chat to follow up on this. So if there's anything that caught your ear there, send the questions in. We'll direct them to Santha and Eve. Eve, 2021, nearly finished. What have we learned?
So actually, for me, what I learned from my daughters, which is quite interesting.
Touching
I've been
Christmas
very
tale.
lucky this year. I've learned a lot at work, especially on topics that I didn't know much about because my role has changed a little bit. So beyond HR, I'm looking at risk a lot, geopolitical risk in particular, and climate risk, and so on. That's great, and I'll talk about that later. But from an HR and people point of view, as I was saying, I learned a lot from my daughters because I've been watching them quite closely. One of them, sort of finished with uni and was looking for jobs up to, a couple of weeks ago, actually. And just watching her, listening to her, looking at how she was looking, what she was looking for, how she was responding to some offers has taught me an enormous amount. Actually, just watching her, I do a lot of big employee surveys, asking loads of people what they think, and I look at comments and so on. But looking, so closely was very different. So what I learned from her was first, that attitude to employers in terms of what she's expecting from them. And I think she's not alone. I think a lot of, sort of young, workers who are entering the workforce, but older workers are asking as well, especially around inspiration and purpose. I think, a lot of that came through so vividly, actually, watching her and listening to her about, when she was going through assessments and so on, what the company website was talking about in terms of climate, in terms of diversity and inclusion and so on. I thought, wow, sort of, I knew that this was happening, but hearing it so close to home was quite interesting. And what I saw also that I'm sure is happening is that, rapidity at making a judgment in saying that company is not right for me. The way they come across, the little videos that I'm seeing, of current employees, that's not me. The focus is not what I'm looking for. And I think, that was quite telling in terms of how companies talk about what they are doing, and also how authentic and genuine they are when they are talking about, sort of these big topics, climate, social responsibility, work with communities, work with the environment, bigger, ticket items. And I think, we have to be very, very careful and knowledgeable of that. So that was my big learning for this year.
Fantastic. So that's opened up, I think, a couple of areas for us, and fire your questions in, please do, on the chat. But it's opened up areas around, what has HR got to do with climate risk? We can go into that, and it's also led us on to the employee experience, I think. So maybe, Tasantha, you could tell us a little bit about where you see employee experience. Is not a new term. I think we're now, I don't know, 5 years into using that pretty widely, something like that. But like all of these things, starts to snowball and snowball. So where do you think organizations broadly that you've dealt with are on employee experience this year? Is it something that they're conscious of widely? Is it still a little bit niche? How are they approaching it?
I think, Alex, they're very, very conscious of it, like organization wide. And previously, pre the pandemic, it was something that was done as a tick box exercise because it's something that they had to do, and it was very much an HR accountability. But if we look at, what the second highest people risk globally, it was actually talent attraction, retention, and engagement. So, and that being so high, it basically just meant that, organizations were exposed and vulnerable around their people because people wanted to be heard. They also needed assistance throughout this pandemic, and organizations became especially dependent on their people during strict lockdown, for example. So what we've seen is, the labor markets have become, incredibly tight across the board, and there's this great resignation that we're referring to. There's wage inflation because, needs changed over the last 2 years. And then there was lots of uncertainty around the vaccine mandates. So, when we look at the employee experience and employee value proposition, are you looking at your EVP holistically? So, purpose. Do you just look say we have this great EVP, but what does that mean? So when we look at EVPs holistically, what is the purpose? What is my purpose within an organization? What does my career look like? Are there career paths for me? Do I see growth in terms of my well-being? Is the organization actually looking after my well-being needs? That was also one of the top risks. And then compensation and benefits. So it's not always just about, the pay. It's also about how are employees rewarded, what benefits are available to them. And, looking at the environment holistically. So look at the employee through the lens of your through the employee, basically, and start listening. So don't just tell, but ask. So what do your employees actually want? And, that takes us to personas, which I think we'll discuss a bit later on, Alex.
Yeah, I think so. No, I think that's it. So from one point of view, the pressure that everybody has been under is causing us to look a bit more consciously at the experience because we're so concerned that it might be really bad or that people are struggling, and therefore we need to look at it a little bit more. Potentially a little dividend that we're going to get from this period, if that is a permanent change. Well, then, Yves, I think Susanta's sort of leading us on there to talk a little bit about the journey, and I think you alluded to that in your learnings as well. If we think about the journey of somebody looking at roles and opportunities and trying to understand which opportunities are for them, how do you kind of mesh the journey onto things like listening strategies that we've been doing before and the design of the experience? How do you feed the journey into those things?
Sorry, Alex, the question was for me?
Yes, sorry, Yves. Sorry, I should have said Yves.
No, that's okay. That's okay.
I just looked at you, but unfortunately it's on a screen and you're next to Santa, so it didn't help at all. But yeah, Yves, fitting the journey into our listening strategies and our experience design.
Yeah, no, I think that's critical actually. So sort of when we talk about like employee experience, I think it's sort of such a huge, a very highly used term, and I think people don't always have a definition for it. And it's exactly what you're describing from our point of view is that you have all these touch points with employees across the employment life cycle from before they join, actually, when they start applying for jobs, to the moment when they leave and become an alumni and continue talking about you as an employer. So all these touch points, I mean, absolutely, you need to really understand, which are the critical ones and identify them. And not actually, what's surprising is that amongst, the most advanced organizations out there, not all of them have done that work yet of trying to really map out that whole journey and understanding, what's happening at these points and so on. Why haven't they done that? First, because they are very often big. You're talking about very large organizations where there's different ways of doing, locally and so on. And it's not easy when you have, mobile employees who move from one market to another and so on. It's quite tough to do. So first of all, identifying these key points and really, just as Tess was, saying, making sure that you understand, ask, but not ask in a simple, sort of simple way. It's not all about surveys. It's about, sort of sitting down. It's about multiplying these points of contacts with employees to make sure that you get, just as Tess was saying, a very holistic picture of what's going on at each of these points. And that's not easy to do because sometimes, think, for example, at exit time, voluntary or involuntary exit of the organization. Will people tell you really what they think? If it's really related to their immediate manager, for example, and so on. So you have to think of really how do we get the best possible information at this point, something that's going to help us remediate or act differently moving forward, or how act in very immediate and hard terms if there is something really critical going on that we haven't understood or captured. So totally, as you were saying, mapping out that journey, making sure that you prioritize as well. You cannot do everything at once. So, for some at the moment, big urgency, as Tess was saying, great resignation, talents really rethinking where they are at for many, different reasons often. So maybe, for some of organizations, it has to be the focus now, understanding, how do we stem that loss of talent. So understanding where you are at, getting good information, making all the links you can make with all information that you already have. And I think that's an under-tapped area for me, that companies out there have so much data. And sometimes, these data are not always used to the extreme extent they could be. So sometimes, you have that data that sits with communications and not shared with HR, or maybe some marketing PR data that is not sort of captured and linked. So I think that doing a good job at talking to each other within an organization and breaking down data silos really and starting to communicate on that can help a lot, understand that journey better, and remediate and put actions in place to really improve the employee experience.
Got it. I think that's a theme that is coming through on the chat as well. Lots of people on there saying
Alex,
communication, communication.
Alex, sorry if I can just add,
No,
you've made
please,
such
please.
an important point with regards to the exit interview. I read
Mhm.
somewhere recently that the majority of individuals who leave organizations are never really honest when they exit the organization because they don't
Mhm.
want to, create this bad perception or, burn
Yeah.
bridges, as we say. But at the same time, that's the organization's expectation. They don't want that bad feedback. So how are they going to learn and grow from that? So I think that as well is a big component of this whole talent strategy and this talent management journey is being open to that feedback, being open to the hard feedback, because that's the only way that you're going to be able to, learn and grow in the process, but as well as be able to retain top talent.
Mm.
So yeah, I just wanted to add that.
No, I think that's a really great point. And now I want to challenge you both because someone on the chat, I'm told by the powers that be who are moderating this discussion, has said, you're both spot on. But how do you establish, and is it even realistic to try and establish the kind of, trust and communication that you were talking about in traditional organizations with tall structures where communication channels are not as open? So we can all imagine the type of organizational culture that they're referring to. How do you, I mean, let's say that it's possible. Christmas is a time of hope. How do you actually make it happen? And either of you,
So
and then the other one jump in, leave me out of it.
I'll get started, Alex, on that because I've seen some great examples. Actually, that's what we're seeing throughout the pandemic. Trust in leaders and communications of leaders and with leaders have improved tremendously. I mean, you see that in the data very clearly. People are responding and are saying, yes, our leaders really did a great job from the beginning of the pandemic because they sort of really added some proximity. They wanted to check, how we were doing as employees. They organized, some team calls, regular communications, and so on. So we've seen really, that trust in leaders shot up, really doing really better. And that has sort of cascaded. So for me, it really starts at the top, at the more senior levels in an organization, when they start modeling that and saying, look, we genuinely care. There are some things that are more important than sort of making tons of money. It's the safety of our employees really matter first, and and we're going to show you that, and people respond very positively to that. Now the challenge is, there's several challenges in my view. The first one is, how do you cascade that from senior leadership to all managers and employees? That's quite a challenge. So there's a lot of manager capability that needs to be developed in doing that, because managers, sometimes grow into managers because they are great technicians, they do their work really well, but they're not always, sort of skilled, developed, trained in, dealing with these comms aspects of the job, in sort of communicating, connecting with people. So there's some of that happens. The second thing for senior leaders to think of, I think, in large organizations is that with new technologies, senior leaders feel, sort of CEOs, let's say, and CEOs say, I can communicate now to everybody and be authentic with everybody. So what they do in doing that, that's great, but they burn all the levels of leadership below them. And sometimes, people get surprised. They say, wow, sort of they have to react to the comms from the top. And, sort of they're not always equipped to say what a specific change will mean locally for employees and so on. So I think my point is, great for leaders to be very communicated, but they have to think of all the layers, in a large organization, and in training, equipping people to tell the rest of the story on how it will apply locally. A given change or a given decision will apply to a team, exactly. So that's
Yeah.
one thing to think of, but yeah.
No. Thank you very much, Tasantha. More to come on that.
Yeah, I think, leadership definitely, because I mean, in a lot of organizations, it was typically HR's responsibility. If someone had an issue, if someone was unhappy, you go to HR. But then it brought up that argument of whose side is HR on, because, HR, it's a difficult one, right? Because HR is meant to be this neutral body that's there for the employee, there for the employer, being like the leadership. But then when it comes down to it, sometimes employees see HR siding with business rather than, taking the employees' needs into account. So I think that would be the first one. And then, leadership are human too. They're not, as Eve's rightfully said, not everyone were people's people. They didn't have the skills that were needed to manage throughout the pandemic. So they also needed to learn and grow throughout this process. So did HR. And if we look at the skills that were rated the most highly for this year, it was collaboration skills, it was inclusive, empathetic management. If we look at self management, the skills that we looked at like 3 years ago are very different from the top skills that are needed now. So I think, in terms of a difficult environment, if you are in a difficult environment, it's going to be a difficult process. I've had conversations and I've run a workshop with an organization. I think for the entire 6 hours, it was about how toxic the environment was, but there wasn't a single leader from the Exco team in that discussion. And when we ended it, they were too afraid to actually take that feedback to the Exco. So, what does that say about the leadership themselves? And then on the other end, you have this employee who cannot leave because they need a paycheck at the end of the month. So I think if you want a committed workforce, it won't always be the case where you're the only employer available. You need to definitely work towards listening to your employees, becoming more people oriented, and creating that culture of inclusiveness. That will definitely make a big impact.
Great. Thank you both. Hopefully that's answered the question for the asker, whose name I don't have, but I do have the names of Sequoia and Benedite and Godson and Adeshola, Olamide, Agnes. Welcome to all of you. Thanks for your comments around communication, around the dependency on HR. Thank you for joining us. Everybody else, chuck your comments and your questions in as quickly as you'd like. I just want to now go on to, we've talked there, raised a couple of points about listening. So we'll come, I think, Eve, to you in a second on listening and get some of those examples of interesting things that have gone on. I want to start with you, Tasantha, on employees and the idea of the employee persona that is around and about. I've read it in a couple of books. I think I've read it in literature from both of you. This is the challenge when you've got two kind of heavyweights of the employee experience on the panel. I could equally send all questions to both of you. But Tasantha, let's start with you on employee profiles. If people haven't heard of them, in a nutshell, what are we talking about?
So, this communication it was always key, but again, the importance of good communication was elevated in the last 2 years. So, what we're saying is that there's no one size fits all approach in the organization. You'll never get to a situation where you communicate something and every single employee is happy. But also understanding that different factors resonate with different employees, and you have different age groups, you have different backgrounds, you have different nationalities. So it's understanding what is important to individuals within your organization. And it's not necessarily the case where it'll just be like one persona, for example, but it's taking the time to understand what and how employees value rewards, benefits, and other elements of the employment relationship. So there will be multiple personas, but what is key in this process is accepting that the different factors resonate differently with individuals. So, for example, retirement may be a concern for someone who's about to retire, but a younger employee may not even care about that. That's not even on their radar. They may be looking at workload and life balance more highly. So when we talk about engagement, employee engagement, it's actually when you get your survey feedback, when you have those focus groups, what are your employees telling you? So when you do things, when you create benefit schemes and policies, what are you doing for the employee themselves? And that's basically what the persona is focused on.
So connecting the work that we're doing with kind of what matters to the individual, or trying to understand the individual a bit better. Okay.
Yes.
Eve, do you want to come in on that as well, from a maybe link it into listening strategies and some of the insight here?
Sure. I think, I totally agree with Steph. Yes, it's really important to really, start thinking about employees in that way. And we do quite a bit of that as well in terms of, sort of the engagement, people surveys that we run. So because we are, at least in some countries, it's not possible everywhere, but in many countries now, you're able to ask quite a lot of sensitive questions and give people the options of, saying, yes, I'm happy to answer these questions or not, about, not only their gender, but sexual preference, for example, or disability status, type of disability, whether they are carers or not. And once you have this data, I mean, you're able to do exactly, that micro segmentation that Tess was talking about, and try to understand, okay, we have really some different, perceptions, attitude, expectations, experiences, lives at work, when we look across, the whole, these all, profiles of employees. And I think it's so powerful to do that. And, what I learned a lot, I've had to present quite a few results where leaders were extremely surprised, actually. So I'll give one example where, these companies and organizations were doing a lot of work on diversity and inclusion in particular. So for, sort of doing the right thing, I would say, sort of opening up, the questions, the conversations around diversity and inclusion and so on. They were on that journey, they were progressing, but then when we started micro-segmenting the data and looking at, sort of different cuts of the data and segments, we realized that, when we were looking at the organization overall, people were saying, yes, we're doing a great job on diversity and inclusion and so on. But when we started cutting, finally the data, we realized that the people concerned by, becoming more inclusive, more diverse, were having a totally different experience from the majority. So looking at the results overall, we're saying, wow, tops, you get top scores, you're really on the right track here. But in terms of the reality, looking finally at the profiles Tess was talking about, we were not there at all. There was a long journey ahead to get to the, the ultimate goal of being inclusive, equitable, and diverse. Yeah, so really critical to look at the data closely.
Right, at the risk of asking a stupid question, it's definitely going to happen over the course of me asking questions for an hour. With something like that, I remember we had COP26 recently, and a lot of people come away from COP26 thinking that's not been too bad, that's been okay. But if you're Greta Thunberg, it was not a good thing. So in the instance there where you have the feeling in an organisation among the majority of people, like on an issue, it's going quite nicely in terms of their standard or how much they care about it, it's going quite nicely. You have a group of people who are in either really passionate about it or more informed about it or whatever it is, and they have a really different opinion. For the organisation, which part of that do you respond to? Are you happy because most people are happy? And then, happy is the wrong word for engagement, so I'm being naughty with happy. But are you happy because people are happy and therefore that's kind of ticking the boxes for most people? Or do you have to come and deal with this group in a different way? What are there risks about going and dealing with that? Are you getting into areas you don't need to be in? Now it's like 15 stupid questions. Deal with all that, please.
You know where I'd start, Alex? I'd start with, and the COP26 is a good example. I'd start by letting those voices in and making sure that you capture them. So I think that was one of the great frustrations for many of COP26, that you saw, so much energy outside of COP. And these voices were, they were there because they were so important, but not involved in the conversation itself. So I think that's what you need to start to do, making sure that, when you look at the data, for example, when we look at engagement surveys, are the people who have participated, is the profile we're getting, the profile that we know we have in the organization in terms of diversity, or are, sort of minority group responding less to that survey? So making sure first, sort of from a statistical point of view, that you are representative and you're not missing out on big, on useful conversations there. And of course, sort of continuing on that example of COP, I think, we know that organizations are, I would say I'm very much of an optimistic person, but out there, I believe that there's some excellent work being done, in all these areas. But I think, if you want to really look at how good you can get, how far you can get, you need to have these voices in, these people who challenge you and tell you, look, you're going too slow. And balancing that and saying, maybe you're right, maybe we could do more in that. So, and I think if you don't do that, if you don't get these voices in, you won't have that involvement that you need to get there, to get to the end point that you've sort of set for yourselves. So I think it is about that for me. It's about inclusion, but involvement of people as well, and that diversity we're all after. That greater diversity. If you don't have that, you won't get the solutions that will make you sort of accelerate and get there. So that's my view. So very, very important to let and listen to these voices and act upon them.
So we have I think it's become well understood now that where we do engagement surveys and things like that, if we just survey and then we don't come back with action or showing that we're listening, that we're doing more damage than if we'd never asked the question. And then I guess if we have a significant portion of people who've got a view that is different from the majority, if we don't engage with that view, then we'd fallen into that trap, I guess. Tasantha, I want to come to you in your capacity on career design and the skills design and all that kind of stuff. We're into climate now a little bit, and that wasn't. If I think back to the conferences we've run over the years, if I go back 2 years, it's not an issue as part of our discussion. Now it really is. It seems to be part of the value proposition, and that leads me to think about what is it that people early in their career are looking for, and then connecting that into what you've said about employee personas. So is there a persona for a group of people that are making this an issue?
I don't think there's a persona specifically, but it'll be an element of the persona. And if you look at the younger generation, I mean, they're looking at things like recognition, working relationships. But one of the stats we saw is that, companies with high carbon emissions were not attractable is not a word, attractive or favorable for the younger workforce, or favorable for the workforce. And I think in terms of climate, it's become much, much more important, because if you look at that whole ESG, the environment, the social and the governance aspect, it's been elevated. It's been around for ages, but now we've given it a term. And if you look at the environment, I mean, companies have a responsibility towards communities, for example. And if I look at South Africa specifically, like our mining industry, there's a mining charter, for example, where, the mines have to invest in the communities around them. And when we look at supply chain, again, supporting local business rather than, always importing. So it's also that element of giving back, which younger people are watching out for. But also, like if you look at pollution, it's a big thing, right? People have become much more conscious. If you look at consumers, they've become much more conscious as well in terms of how they buy, who they support. Preferences have changed in the last few years. So from a younger generation perspective and the personas that you're looking at, definitely, if you're looking to attract a younger workforce and attract new skills, you have to take that take those factors into consideration. I think another point I wanted to make is in terms of attraction and retention is it doesn't just mean the highest paycheck. There's lots of other aspects to consider. What will make me join, what will make me stay, and what will make me leave. Why would I want to leave your organization? So each, I guess, generation has different needs and requirements, but understanding what those needs are definitely has a big impact on the workforce.
Yeah, absolutely. I think when you were speaking there, it brought to mind something for me where I thought, actually, I have seen organisations dealing with this prior to the last couple of years. And the place that I first saw it was in tobacco companies. So it's this thing again, that necessity being the mother of invention. These guys were well ahead of the rest of us in terms of thinking about how to incorporate the ESG type of stuff into their value propositions, and they were doing it because they were dealing with a product that for a lot of people they were trying to attract was problematic. So interesting to see again that as we've been all forced to think more about agility over the last couple of years, we're all being forced into it by necessity, and maybe if we can get a little bit more vision we'll be able to chill out a little bit. It won't feel like we're chasing our
Yeah,
tails the whole time.
definitely. And Alex, Southern Africa actually has the youngest population in the world, with over 60% under the age of 25. So you dealing with the young population, you need to invest in that young population, because it's that population which is going to take you forward. So definitely
Yeah.
big on the agenda.
The necessity is upon us all now to
Yeah,
incorporate these themes into our value propositions.
yeah.
I've got one more question around that's coming from Gregor in the audience about personas, and then I want to shift into something else for a little bit. So, Santa, I'll come to you on this because I think it's been the things that you've been speaking about. Gregory is talking about 16 traditional personality types that are kind of doctrine for HR. How do those mesh into the personas that we've discussed? Is it something that can be
So
put together?
Yeah, so we haven't actually looked at personality types. We're actually looking at factors across rewards, benefits, and other elements to actually understand. We're calling it the unmet needs. So, what are the unmet needs of the organization, rather than looking at personalities? And you would look at personalities when you have employees, recruited, or when they're joining or up for promotion. Then you would consider those skill sets and linked to the personality type. For example, in a sales force, do you want an introvert? So it's a different set of needs which we are taking into consideration for the personas when we talk about communication. Yeah.
Clear. So separate tools using for different things.
Correct. Yeah.
Clear. Clear.
And I think someone asked about the barriers to communication in the chat, and I think
Yeah, let's
Eves
sort
will
that as
all.
well. Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I think
Yeah.
Eves will also be able to comment. I think a lot of barriers is also that lack of information sharing, and it's not just with the employee population, because if you look at HR, traditionally they were left out of a lot of big decisions, or they weren't informed. They get told afterwards, and then they have to deal with putting out the fires. There's also lots of truth in the rumor mill, as we know. So it's investing time in that process of communication and understanding what works for the organization. And I'll say it again, there's no one size fits all. You need to understand the different stakeholder groups in your organization and communicate accordingly. And definitely, it breaks trust when you hear something via the grapevine instead of hearing it from your organization. So that's something that organizations can easily fix in terms of a process, but not many organizations take the time to invest in that process.
Okay. Okay, Eve, just on that one.
Yeah.
I know we're often dealing with large companies. You're dealing with large companies, not least because you're both extremely expensive, reflective of the fact that you're extremely good, but you're dealing with multinational organizations and large regional organizations that have lots of people, lots of time in HR, lots of hours, can afford to deploy the kind of solutions that we will offer for some of these things. If I'm the HR person in a business, or it's me and an exec, and we're doing it all on our own, how do we approach communication strategies and breaking down those barriers? What do we do first with the limited amount of time and resource that we have?
Yeah, I think it's not. So I would argue that with technology today, it's not expensive to communicate, sort of frequently, differently, in a very engaging way with people. So I'll give you an example. Sort of if you were what our clients are using, we are using with our clients a technology that we call virtual focus group. There's loads of them out there if you start, sort of inquiring on that. But what's that? I mean, it's something that you can set up, very quickly, a few questions. You invite people to join online just as we are now, and you ask them really critical questions on their experience, but also the business. Yeah, how could we work differently? So you really tap their intelligence and talent. That so that's something that you can do, set up quickly, set up cheaply, involve 500, 1,000 people at once, to come and join a discussion. And why not use a strategy like that as part of a communication, strategy to try to invite people to really get involved, participate, and in exchange of, the time they spend doing that, people feel more engaged and motivated. So I would say, it's not a question of costs always. I think you can do it well. I think it's more a question of, how do we do that? Do we use, different modes of interacting with people? Some CEOs are very good at having open meetings, breakfast. Every time they go on site, they sit down with groups of employees and take the time, to look at survey results, for example, before having these meetings, saying to people, look, you're telling us this, that, and that. Is that really your experience, and so on? So really an informed, data-driven conversation with people, very open. But there's so many multiple ways that can be used. And you're going to tell me, for a CEO, even for a CEO of an organization of 500 people on several sites, it's not easy to do all these open meetings. But a CEO, she's never only alone, yeah? She's got, people around her to really help her, an executive team. So what we see some of our clients doing is having each leader, let's say the CFO, for example, or the head of legal, being a chaperone for one side. So he becomes a voice of the executive team. And, that's my side for this year. And, they make sure that they have several meetings and visit and talk and capture information, bring it back to the execs and so on. There's so many modes of doing that. I'll give another one, that's really important in my view. So I have the chance of working on the FMCG, food and beverage company, and Danone have a system of, let me say that in 2 minutes. And basically they do, engagement survey with us, people surveys, strategic surveys with employees and so on. And in their survey, what they do is that they ask people to say, be a volunteer. By volunteer is, sort of working not only, to improve the organization from within, efficiency and so on, improve the work with communities, with the environment and so on. And people raise their hand and say, yes, I want to be a volunteer. What happens is behind that, there's a whole process where these volunteers get together into teams locally, get their ideas together, present their ideas to management, and then get involved and become the voice, the local voice, get involved and invited to come to execs about their ideas and so on. So what I'm saying is that, sort of look at what you're doing already in terms of communicating, look at what's available, cheap, effective, and vary the modes of communications with employees so that you have not one channel, but multiple channels up and down and up and so on. So yeah. So
there's no excuse. There's no excuse. There's a way to get things done, especially with technology. We should start looking ahead to 2022 because it's just around the corner now. So Tasantha, I'd like to come to you and say, what are the things that are going to be new in 22? What should we be looking out for in terms of trends? And then also as a Christmas present from me, as a Mercer product or initiative that people should be keeping an eye on next year. Eve, I've got a present for you too.
Thanks, Alex. So I think what's important to understand is you won't always be aware of what's coming, but you can be prepared to adapt quickly and respond accordingly. And that's what will enable organizations to progress through any form of change. So this doesn't mean that it's not going to be challenging, but taking all impacted stakeholders along the journey. Definitely in 2022 we need to realize that it's the workforce that's impacted, not just the organization, the profit making machine. So don't wait for the next major disruption to trigger action, because you'll remain very, very vulnerable in the process. And employers are facing many challenges but also opportunities for the workforce. And in order for business to become more resilient, it's time to review their people risk. So, Mercer analyzed the 5 pillars of people risk, which included the greatest HR threats organizations are facing. And these included, workforce exhaustion, increasing health risk protection and well-being benefit cost, cybersecurity, talent attraction, retention, and engagement, and then as well as the environment, which we've been speaking about, quite extensively. So, in terms of Mercer's offerings, and thank you for the gift, Alex. We basically partner very closely with organizations, a lot of global multinationals, locally and internationally. To help them through that whole employee journey from hire through retire. So, creating that experience that is long lasting, that relationship that is positive, and we work very closely with organizations to look at careers, career pathing. When we look at flexibility, it's not just about the time or the hours you work, it's about where you can work from, what roles can you change to. Flexibility is such a agile word in itself. And then we have our skills library. So we've basically identified every single skill linked to every single job globally.
All the
Um,
skills there are, or every
exactly. Yeah.
skill in the world. Amazing.
Correct. Yes, in the universe. Let's put it that way. So we're very, very big on the employee journey and helping employers help employees, stay happy, healthy, and focused within the organization, and enabling them to learn and grow continuously.
Fantastic. Fantastic. And Eve, the same question then. What do you see next year being particularly important, and what Willis Towers Watson goodie would you like to tell the people about?
Okay, so sort of, we asked that question actually very recently to leaders around the world about what would be their priority, and I think it's exactly what we've discussed. So what came through is that I think 94% of the people we asked said the employee experience would be their area of focus moving forward. So sort of understanding what is experience, but also building an employee experience strategy that was going to be the focus. So that's definitely something we are hearing. Linked to that, making sure that your that organizations are listening, connecting with employees, what we've talked about this morning again. Then moving on, I think one of the key priority will continue to be diversity and inclusion, well-being. I think that's here to stay, and organizations, in my view, are realizing how much work there is to do, and want to and are committed to doing that work. So that's really great. Another area is that we've realized that there's no going back in terms of hybrid working, flexible work. So the question is now, and that's linked to well-being, how do we facilitate that as organizations, and how much, what's the balance there in terms of flexible hybrid work, and how do we make sure that people are able to do that? Because there's some big questions here. So if you're a mom, and like so many at the moment, where children are ill, or sort of COVID strikes and so on, how do you continue working and working effectively, not being distracted? So all that support will be very, very essential. So I think these are the big topics. And I think our conversation this morning, there's one thing, to your point, Alex, about services that we offer, that I think could be quite promising next year. It's something that we've done a lot in the States up to now, but it's taking off a lot here. By here, I mean in Western Europe, in the UK in particular, in the total reward optimization, where we are asking employees again what they value in terms of their benefits. So we present, different sets of benefits. And I think, Tess, you made that point earlier around, sort of, not everyone wants the same thing. Not one package makes sense to all. And sometimes employers offer things that people just don't value. So that, sort of total reward optimization helps you really understand what is, sort of the optimal package, or sets of packages and flexible packages we can offer to people that are engaging and invite them to stay with the organization. So that would be one thing, if you want to hear more, happy to talk about that. But and we're not the only one to do that type of work, by the way.
No.
So, but I think it's quite promising and taking off.
Fantastic. Okay, so a couple of things there. I mean, we'll capture all that in the follow-up to this as well, and make sure that we signpost the solutions that Tasantha and Yves mentioned, so that you can dig into those yourselves a bit more. We have just the 5 minutes remaining, and everybody on this call is about to jump to another conference. They're so in demand, so we need to use every minute. If you have any questions for them, throw them in now. I reckon I can take about one more question, so fire them in quickly. I'll choose the best or fastest of the questions, and we'll go with that. In the meantime, stocking filler questions. So these have got to be really short and sharp, guys, because we're running out of time. Tess, you mentioned you alluded to the skills order, the skillsy-verse, and the top skills. What are the top skills in demand at the moment? Give us 2 or 3 of them really quickly.
Yeah, so like I said, Alex, the collaboration skills, so if we look at top skills that are needed in any organization at the moment, it's collaboration skills, self-management, prioritization, inclusive, empathetic management, digital dexterity, adaptability, innovation, market sensing, um, learning orientation, inspiration and engagement skills, and internal political influence. So those are the top skills that we've seen through our survey.
Fantastic. We'll have to write those down and get those circulated in a blog post. I assume digital dexterity goes further than just knowing when you're on mute on a Zoom call and everybody's shouting at the screen that you're on
Correct.
mute. Yeah.
Correct.
Eve, you mentioned some really interesting insights that have come out of surveys this year. Is there one insight or one learning that grabs you beyond the one that we spoke about earlier? Something that really grabbed you from a survey this year?
From surveys this year, what grabs me is how resilient and engaged people continue to be. I think despite all the challenges out there, people continue to work really hard to continue to give all they can for their organization. Of course, that many of the people we ask questions to, many of the people we interview, they're very lucky to still have a job, because many haven't had that luxury. But that resilience, that adaptability, that willingness to continue, to challenge yourself in a context like this one. I mean, it's amazing. I mean, I've been on calls where you see people having to leave to attend to their child well, but keeping going, keeping, that level of, giving for work is amazing.
We've been tested, and a great many of us have passed with flying colours. What about, we've got this one question, we'll have to deal with it really quickly. It's about making decisions based on the data that you get back, and I guess the data we've talked about most is EX type data. But if you both could briefly address it, Samantha, jump in first, if you would.
Sure.
How to make accurate decisions with the data.
Yeah, I think, Alex, it's such a good question because there's a very big difference between what organizations say versus what they do. So if you're telling your organization something, they've seen the data. So for example, if they feel the environment is unsafe, you are seeing that as an output of the data and still doing nothing with it, then you failed your employees. So take the data into consideration when you're making decisions. Stop just making decisions because it's a tick box exercise and you think it's the great thing to do in order to progress. Listen to the employees.
Great point. Eve, anything? I think we're covered. I want to come to you with a final thought instead, because I think we're at that time of the session. So, anything you'd like to leave people with beyond your heartfelt Christmas wishes? I know you've both got places to be. So, Eve, we'll come to you first. Just a final thought for the audience.
So continue. I think linked to actually that question of data, I think it's very important to sort of not only have one source of data but multiple sources. Hold off and hold your sort of your intuition. Don't jump. Review everything. Triangulate, as we say, sort of in research. Make sure that you use all this data. Talk to each other. Involve others in the analysis, and then you need to trust your intuition in the end. You're a leader, so you need to decide and move forward. So I think to leave a thought, to leave people with very simple one, sort of continue talking. Conversations are good. Don't exclude anyone. Bring them in, and sort of we'll all get better if we continue sort of purposefully and authentically listening and talking to each other.
Fantastic. And to Samantha, from you, a final word.
Yeah, I think we can all just do better and be better and create a culture of trust because we're all on the same team. So let's just help each other out.
the biggest, I think both of you have touched on the biggest themes that we've seen from all the chat. There's the questions we've got, irrelevant. The questions that are coming on the chat, communication and trust, are the central themes that people have been interested in today. And thanks for speaking to those. So I want to wrap up now and say thank you. Also say good morning to Comlan, Jose, say good morning to Tommy, everybody that joined us today. Thank you for your questions and your comments. And say thank you very, very much to Eve, Senior Director at Willis Towers Watson, to Santha, Career Consultant at Mercer, two fantastic organisations with fantastic services, and lots and lots to teach us. So thank you for giving us your time. I want to thank you all for joining us, and also thank the Talent Agenda series for putting this discussion on. Thank you for convening us every few weeks for these things. I believe some information is going to come out in follow-up about some of the things that GCC can offer over the coming year to support organisations around communicating some of the value propositions and brands that you've developed and bringing talent into the organisation too. So please keep an eye on your inboxes for those. If we were in a place where we could applaud, I'd encourage you to do it. I think we just have to assume that you are. And thank you all very much for joining us again. I wish you a great holiday season, and see you all again very soon.
Thanks, everyone. Bye.
Thank you, everybody. Bye-bye.
Happy holidays.